All right. I think we're live. Welcome everybody to this Dev Shop Marketing Briefing. Today's subject is specializing with little or no relevant proof. This is a topic that's come up over and over again in my work with people on making that transition from a generalist to a specialist. It's almost always just a huge concern that comes up pretty early in the process. It tends to I don't want to call it a fear because it is a legitimate concern, but this concern tends to come up right around the time someone feels like they have a pretty good candidate for how they might specialize. So that's the timing of when this tends to happen. And a lot of times if you don't see the big picture of how proof and trust works, this concern that you lack relevant proof can be enough to sort of stall your forward progress and convince you that it's not a good idea to specialize. Now, in some cases that may be true, but I think a lot of times it's actually not true. And you're missing some of the context that I see in terms of how people sell professional services. So I wanted to talk about that today. The way these Dev Shop marketing briefings go, we're recording right now, so this recording will be available later. I try to keep the presentation short enough that there's lots of time for questions. I'm aiming for 20 minutes, but to be honest, I've not done a run through of this one, so it may go a little bit longer. It's all good stuff, though. I hope that it will be very beneficial to you, and I hope that if you have questions that occur to you during the presentation, just drop those in the chat window, mostly as just kind of a way to remember the question and sort of get in line to discuss or get an answer to that question. After the presentation, I open it up for questions, and we'll see what's accumulated in the chat window. I won't be able to see that while I'm giving the presentation, so just know that anything you type in there, I won't really be able to respond to. But let's kind of build up a backlog of questions in the chat window while I'm presenting, and then we'll tackle those afterwards. And part of the reason why I use Zoom meetings rather than Zoom's webinar product is that it just makes it very easy for us to have a sort of peer-to-peer discussion. So during the Q&A, I welcome anybody who wants to kind of jump in and ask clarifying questions or follow-up questions or anything like that you'd like to. So that's how we'll run things. I think that's really it. Just kind of keep yourself on mute during the presentation so the audio quality is good for everybody. And I think we'll be fine. So let me share my screen here, and then I'll get a slide deck up on the screen, and then I'm going to go through that again with the idea that maybe I can spend about 20 minutes talking about this topic before we dive into questions. Okay. Can someone unmute for long enough to tell me that you're seeing my slide presentation?
Yeah, we got it.
Great. Thank you. Okay. So again, we are going to talk about how you might specialize if you have little or no relevant proof. And that's probably already bringing up some questions. What is relevant proof? Why does it matter? We'll get to that. So I'm going to quote myself here. The best specializations are a highly functional combination of your interest, your credibility, and the market's demand. So in this presentation, I'm really zeroing in on that middle of those three things: your interest, your credibility, that's what we're talking about today, and the market's demand. So the fact that that's what makes for a good specialization would seem to create a problem. If you're a generalist, if you have been a generalist, maybe it doesn't even really matter how long you've been a generalist. I've spoken with people who've been generalists for decades or more. And they often find themselves in a situation where they've done a lot of work for a lot of different kind of clients, but there's no pattern of, well, I did a lot of work for this kind of client, and so therefore I have a bunch of relevant proof that I've worked for that type of client before. And in a few, I'm going to drill down a little bit more into what I mean when I say that kind of client. There are 5 different ways you can specialize. One of them is to focus on a type of client. And so I'm kind of making the assumption that that's the form of specializing that you're investigating. So it's very common for generalists to have no kind of cluster, or if you think of a heat map, there's certainly no big red spot on that heat map that signifies a place where you have a bunch of relevant proof, because as a generalist, you're typically not doing anything to focus who you provide your services to. And so it can be just kind of all over the map. That's very common. And that would seem to create a problem where, as you think about specializing, you begin to doubt that you have enough relevant, compelling experience in any one area to support a specialization. Now, I think that actually is not the case. But before we dive any deeper, I should just make sure we're all on the same page with how it is that you can specialize. I've seen 5 basic ways that specializations work. One is choosing a market vertical. And so an example of that might be someone who focuses on building custom software for manufacturing businesses. Manufacturing is a market vertical. It's a pretty big one, but that's an example of focusing on a market vertical. The second example is where you pick a problem domain. Think about all the retail businesses that are being disrupted by Amazon. They have a problem, and that problem may show up in retail, but it may show up actually in other areas outside of retail. And so you might become some kind of a specialist in helping businesses who have been disrupted by Amazon and develop real expertise. That's the second way. I mean, that's not the only way you might specialize, but that's the second example, or the second type of specialization. The third is to pick a technology platform and become some kind of world-class expert at either the platform itself or some subset of using that platform. A good example would be someone who's an expert in security for Rails. Great example of a specialized expertise that's really focused on a platform. And then the fourth basic way that you might specialize is to customize how you deliver your services. So I've seen things like, we'll build a website for you in 3 days. That's a specialization that may not focus on a particular target market. That service might be offered to anybody. It doesn't per se focus on a problem domain, but it packages the services in a way that's unique and specialized. And that can be, in some cases, a valid way to specialize. And then the fifth thing is you can combine 2 of any of those other approaches. So let's get back to our problem. How bad could this be that you are a generalist and you want to specialize, but you feel like you lack relevant proof? Let's imagine the world's most difficult prospect, TWMDP. They're going to set up a sort of gauntlet for you to make it through in order to be considered a candidate for some project. And in speaking to buyers at bigger companies in the past, I've seen these 7 things tend to be part of the gauntlet. This is going to be different for every client. It's not necessarily going to be the same, but they're definitely going to be interested in knowing that you have a track record of prior success doing the thing that they might hire you to do. They may want to see references. They may want to see like you actually be able to demonstrate your credibility and your expertise, both in the technology of what you're doing and in terms of project management. Sometimes they're looking for a deep bench or scalable capacity because really what they're doing is hiring you for staff augmentation. Not always, but sometimes. They may need internal consensus from other stakeholders. So you may have to meet a bunch of people different within the company, and they all sort of agree that you're the company for their needs. And a lot of times that consensus is driven by a sort of desire that everybody has to not get in trouble if they make the bad decision. So they want to make sure it's a group consensus before they hire you. They may have a rate card or some kind of preferred vendor list. And if you're not on that, then you really have to have some kind of unique, compelling value that allows them to make an exception to their policy of only paying what's on the rate card or only hiring from their preferred vendor list. And a lot of times they're looking for a sort of fit in terms of culture or process or things like that. So I believe what happens to the generalist is they say, if I specialize, I'm going to have to make it through this gauntlet, and I have to check off like maybe all 7 items on that list for the world's most demanding prospect. And that just seems daunting. I'd rather just keep doing what's kind of been working. And really there's 4 items on that list that have to do with proof. The track record of prior success, references, or perhaps social proof, or other companies will say, yeah, we worked with this outfit and they did a great job. The demonstration of skill is the third thing that really is about proof. And then finally, some kind of unique value. Those are really the 4 things that are pertinent to our discussion today. And what I want you to know is that having seen lots of people who are making that transition out of being a generalist and into some kind of specialization, we're all biased to think in terms of relevant proof. So what that means is we tend to discount other forms of proof that aren't relevant proof. And I promise, going to define what relevant proof is. So we're biased to think, well, we need a track record of prior success, but it has to be relevant. It has to be exactly what we're proposing doing for this client. Or these need to be relevant references, or these need to be relevant skills that we're applying. And maybe in some cases, but I'm not so sure it's always that way. I think we can think a little more broadly about proof. And if we do that, maybe things don't look so hopeless for the discouraged generalist who's thinking about specializing. I've used this word proof, and I'd like to say what I think it is. So proof is anything you can show or tell, or I guess it would be any kind of activity that you could perform with a prospective client before they decide to hire you that increases their trust or decreases their perception of risk about hiring you. That's really what proof is. And really, if you think about it, the key element there is trust. So our challenge, or your challenge as a generalist who's moving into a specialization, is really to answer the question, how can I build trust with prospects? And I think if you think about it in those terms, you can think about things that are not just relevant proof, but also have the effect of building trust. So thinking a little more broadly about this, I believe, is helpful. There's some ways to increase trust. There's what I call the insider advantage. There's what I call, for lack of a better term, the specialist hunger. And then we can use some different types of proof: relevant, ambient, and constructed proof. So let's talk about those things. Think about when you talk with a fellow software developer. So someone else who's a software developer, think about the kind of conversation you have with them compared to the kind of conversation you have with a relative at a family reunion, and that relative doesn't know the first thing about software. Different conversations, right? The relative who knows nothing, you're kind of like, well, I work with computers or I write software that makes computers do things. And they're like, oh, like Microsoft? And you're like, no, custom software that, does things that Microsoft Office doesn't do. And it's a more difficult conversation when you're talking to someone who's not also a software developer. And when you're talking with a software developer, it's much easier to have that conversation because you have a shared vocabulary, shared interest, shared experiences. I mean, maybe they're not, maybe you're a Rails developer and they're a .NET developer, but still, you have enough in common in terms of the vocabulary and the interest that there's still plenty you can talk about. You may even have a shared worldview. You might have similar values, like you think it's just idiotic that technology is not used to facilitate, democracy, for example. And so having those things in common means you're both members of the same audience. And the type of conversation you have is dramatically different when you share those things in common. So if you specialize, I'm going to use as an example here, specializing by focusing on a market vertical, then you make yourself a member of the same audience as your prospective clients. Now, you're not completely an insider in their world. It's not like they think you're as much of an insider as they are, but you're more of an insider than other generalists. It's not like you can claim to be a long-time insider if you made this decision 6 months ago. You know, you're new to their world, but you're more of an insider than other generalists. And you may not have much of a reputation in their world. You may not be well known, but you're more of an insider than other generalists. And if there's one thing I've really seen about specializing, it's not at all a magic bullet, but it is a way of combining multiple small but significant advantages to give yourself a real advantage in finding and winning and selling business at a premium rate. So when you make yourself an insider, you start to recruit these little subtle advantages in your favor. The insider advantage begins immediately. As soon as I guess I should define immediately. Like, you can't just snap your fingers and do it. But if you put a little bit of action behind a decision to specialize, then you'll very quickly start to become an insider. And I've seen it deliver results quickly. When people work with me in my accelerator program, sometimes I make them do a bunch of not fun research. When I say make them, I mean that a little bit jokingly, but I encourage that because you start to develop this insider advantage very quickly by interviewing people about their problems. When I say people, I mean people in a specific market vertical or people who are experiencing a specific problem. I have seen that turn into results surprisingly quickly. The fastest I've ever seen is someone, in, let's say, month 1 or 2 of this process, starts reaching out and getting some interviews, customer development style interviews with people, and they do the interviews, and then they start getting this question like, hey, can you tell me a little bit about your services, or why are you focused on this vertical, or are you available for work? Questions like that are, I think, more than just sort of casual, curious, polite conversation questions. They're questions that sometimes lead to a project, or the type of questions that sometimes lead to a project. And sometimes it's also a very fast referral that happens after you start doing this research. So that's not guaranteed to happen. I'm not saying this is some kind of magic bullet hack to getting your first few projects by specializing, but it does happen sometimes. And I attribute that to what I call the insider advantage, where someone is just kind of surprised that you're a software developer who are, I'll talk about this a little more in a moment, software developers, I love you guys, but you're one of the, I believe, one of the professions that takes the least advantage of specialization. And so therefore, it's kind of surprising when you meet a software developer who's specialized in a meaningful way. And people react to that. So the insider advantage grows stronger over time. It starts right away, but it about 6 or 12 months is what I find that most people can build up an amazing amount of understanding of a particular target market. It may take longer, it could happen shorter, but in the big picture of your life, a year developing a really significant, compelling advantage, it's not a long time, not that really a long period of time. And so you can very quickly develop this advantage. As always, your mileage may vary. There are some verticals that are not going to respond at all, quite frankly, to the insider advantage. They'll never see you as an insider. I don't have any ready examples of verticals like that. I have seen verticals that are a little suspicious of outsiders. Finance comes to mind when I think about that. Doesn't mean you can't specialize in finance. It just means it might take longer to be perceived as an insider. Let's talk about the specialist hunger. I got to be honest, I'm not 100% satisfied with how I articulate this. The bottom line is, in our modern culture, specialists are valued. And I think it's because as a society, or as members of a society, we understand that there's some problems that really are complex and really are difficult. And those problems have value when they're solved. And so there's real benefit when people fully focus themselves on solving those problems. So there's value to specializing, and it's just perceived as worth it. Like one of the examples I've used in the past, if you were diagnosed, heaven forbid, with some kind of fatal brain tumor, would you go see a doctor who said that they will operate on that and the price will be $7,000 for the operation? And if you shopped around and then found another doctor who's like, yep, I'm a specialist in this, it's $100,000 to pull that sucker out and get you all fixed up, which one of those would you choose? I don't know. If you're anything like me, you would choose the $100,000 operation, even if you couldn't afford it, because there's this perception that that person is a specialist and they are charging appropriately for their expertise, and we want certain problems to be dealt with by specialists. So what I'm saying is that our society recognizes the value of specializing. In other professions like CPAs, medicine, law, there's a roadmap that's reasonably well defined, a roadmap to specializing. So the research I've done, which is kind of superficial, but I was pretty satisfied with what I found. Something like 70% of physicians are specialized in some way. Something like 35% of CPAs are specialized in some way. I didn't look at attorneys, but I'd be surprised if it wasn't different, or if it wasn't in the same range of between, let's say, 35% and 70% of attorneys who are specialized. In the world of software development, there's not really much of a roadmap to specialization globally. Specifically, there might be, you might get a job at, let's say, some company like Google, and they probably have a sort of internal professional development roadmap that leads you towards specialization within the needs of what Google needs. But in terms of a general kind of roadmap for specialization, I don't think that really exists much in software development. And in a way, that's what my business is all about, is trying to fix that one. I think it's a problem in the world of software development. So as a result, specialists are kind of underrepresented in the world of software development. It's just less common for you to come across people who are specialized software developers. Now, there is a sort of idea in the world of software development that if you focus at all in any way, you have somehow become a specialist. So if someone, thinks of themselves as a full stack developer, and then they decide they're just going to focus on the back end, they will often say they're a back end specialist or something. And I don't mean to be mean or dismissive, but that's not really a specialization. The specializations that have the most value are intricately connected to a business problem. That's really the source of the value of the specializing, is the underlying business problem that you can solve. So if you focus on the back end, that's not really specific enough to qualify as a specialization. The other way that people will specialize is by focusing on a particular technology platform, which can, I think, work as a specialization, but the barrier to entry to doing that is super low. Your competition is every underemployed person who has a lot of time on their hands and can build their technical skill to the same level or better level than yours. And that's actually not, from a competitive standpoint, that's not a place you want to be in. So anyway, my larger point here is that software development is a profession where specialization is not as common. And So because of how specialists are perceived in the culture and how relatively rare specialization is in the world of software development, you will become more memorable, referable, and easier for prospects to pay attention to if you specialize. And that's really what I mean when I talk about the specialization hunger, is people are a little surprised when they meet an effectively specialized software developer. And that works in your advantage. That makes you more memorable. That makes it easier for people to refer you. That gets people's attention. It doesn't substitute for having proof, but it helps. Okay, so we've talked about, what have we talked about? Specialist hunger. Before that, let me flip back here. The insider advantage. Let's talk about proof now. I should do a whole nother, probably a series of briefings on proof. I don't have time to explain everything on the list here. I'm just going to call it out. There's lots of forms of proof, and what I want to do is just kind of help you see the overview of all the different forms of proof, and then pull out, to kind of group them into three categories. So there's social proof, which really includes things like testimonials, case studies, clients who serve as a reference. If you get, if you're a Rails developer and you get DHH to endorse you as, the world's third best Rails developer or something, that would be a third-party endorsement that would probably carry some weight. And then finally, logos of clients qualify as social proof, but those I think are the weakest form. They're, anybody can stick a logo on their site. It doesn't really mean much. It's better than nothing, but still. The next big form of proof, a demonstration of skill or expertise. Guarantees are received as a form of proof. You'd have to be an idiot to offer a full money-back guarantee on work that you're not confident in. Being an expert gives you confidence in your work. So it works out that pretty much only experts would offer a guarantee. So it's a form of proof. Demonstrating how you produce uniquely valuable results is a form of proof. Being very specific in your marketing, articulating a contrarian viewpoint, acknowledging any weakness in your claims actually is a form of proof. Third-party proof, like let's see. A good example of that might be some study about software development practices that indicates that the way you do software development is the most successful way. So they, some company like Gartner went out and studied the whole industry and found that companies that use Agile and do the following two things are more successful in their projects than any others, and you use that as third-party proof. That's what I mean there. And then finally, playing up your specialization is actually a form of proof, kind of because our culture has a sort of ambient, built-in respect for specialists. So those are all the different types of proof that you might make use of. And I want to group those into three kind of meta categories: relevant proof, ambient proof, and constructed proof. So relevant proof is having done for a previous client what you propose to do for a prospect. So if you can say, yes, we have built a SaaS app and successfully helped our client A launch that SaaS app, and now we are proposing on building a SaaS app for you, prospect B, that's relevant proof. And again, at the top of this presentation, I said, that's what we all are biased to look at. I think that's natural. It is the strongest form of proof, but it's not the only form of proof. Ambient proof is proof that speaks to your character, ability to move a project to successful completion, or the ease of working with you. I got a question just before the this call started from Lee. Lee, I saw you're in the audience. Good to see you here, man. And the question was like, what is ambient proof? Can you provide an example? So ambient proof is what you tend to see on most businesses' websites because it's the easiest to get. Here's an example. I'll just make this up on the fly, but imagine that you went back to a previous client and you said, I love working on this project, and I'd really like to get a quote from you to use on my website. If you left that client to their own devices and just said, would you please give me a quote? And then they did that, they are likely to give you a quote that falls under the category of ambient proof. And they'll say something like, Philip was just the best combination of easygoing and, really knowledgeable that we've ever worked with. And we never stressed out about the project. And it just was a dream working with him. Highly recommended. That's just a quick made up example of what I would call ambient proof. It talks about what it's like to work with you, but it's actually not talking about expertise. It's actually not talking about how you moved the needle for that company. It's actually not talking about anything that would be on that sort of first tier of impressive, powerful proof. That's why I call it ambient proof. It's kind of like, it's nice. It's better than nothing, but it's not as powerful as that relevant proof that says, I'll give you an example. Let's say the same company gave me a quote, but they provided a better form of proof. And they said, we engaged Philip to build the software for us. And it came in at, 15% under budget. And our biggest surprise of all was that as a result, sales went up, 87%. Something like that is much more powerful. And ideally, if it's relevant, it's even more helpful. The last form of proof is constructed proof. It's a demonstration of your expertise, insight, or skill, or thinking as applied to your specialization. And I want to talk about that a little bit more in a moment. So almost any, let me go back and just kind of add one more layer of detail here. So almost any person who has been providing professional services of any kind for more than a year or two can collect some ambient proof. Maybe, even if you just are starting out working for yourself, you can usually circle back to your, some bosses that you didn't hate and ask them for some kind of, ambient proof. Even if you weren't independent or self-employed at the time, you can usually circle back and get that kind of thing. So we almost all have ambient proof. And, the problem with relevant proof with a generalist who's thinking about specializing is that they feel like they don't have enough relevant proof, enough proof that lines up with the way in which they're thinking about specializing. Okay. But that's where constructed proof comes in. And I want to dive a little more deeper into that. So let's say that you were considering specializing in being the same kind of software developer you are now, but focusing just on pharmaceutical companies. And let's say you have some ambient proof from previous clients, but none of them are pharmaceutical companies. Then you're in the situation, which is kind of the red hot center of what we're talking about here, which is you would say, I have no relevant proof. How is any pharmaceutical client going to consider hiring me if I lack relevant proof? Some of them may never consider hiring you, but I don't think that's a reason to not specialize. Could you interview 10 CTOs at pharmaceutical companies? Maybe not the big boys. You'll probably never get the CTO to answer an email, but some smaller companies. Could you interview them about the challenges of getting a strong return on investment in custom software? I think you could if you've set your mind to it. I mean, if you can understand XML, you can probably pull this off. Could you do enough online research to identify the 5 most common threats that scrappy upstart startups are posing to the larger pharmaceutical companies? I almost guarantee you could. Some journalist has probably done all the work of identifying what those 5 threats are. At bigger companies, IBM does that for you. IBM has their yearly C-suite study where they interview hundreds of C-level executives and ask them what they are concerned about in the world of technology and what they're trying to take advantage of. And could you use information like that as the basis for a series of, half dozen in-depth articles about how those threats might be mitigated? I think you could. It's not easy. it's not as fun as maybe some of the other things you're doing, but I think it's perfectly viable. Or a third example, could you identify a single urgent, painful issue that your farmer prospects are struggling with, build some kind of software proof of concept and open source it, and then use that as a sort of linchpin of your marketing to that vertical? I also think the answer is yes. These are just three examples, and it's not at all, these don't limit things at all. They're just there to try to help you conceptualize how constructed proof works. So constructed proof is really you on your own initiative looking into the problem domain that's relevant to how you're thinking about specializing and creating what ultimately ends up being marketing material. But that marketing material is a byproduct of you learning about the business problems, the real business needs of the world that you're thinking about focusing on. That's why I call it constructed. You make it, but it doesn't require that you have done any previous work with a client. And remember the big picture here as we talk about constructed proof. I'm not at all advocating that you try to deceive anybody or trick anybody into thinking you have more experience than you actually do. What we're trying to do is harness multiple small advantages, multiple ways of building trust with your prospects. And when you start stacking up ambient proof and whatever relevant proof you do have and constructed proof and other ways of building trust, you start to get an advantage that the other generalists don't have. So there's two other kind of weird, unexpected advantages that happen as a byproduct of specializing that can help you overcome the lack of relevant proof. One is when you specialize, your marketing tends to start to become more focused and gives off this feeling of you as a disciplined person. And this applies, by the way, to small shops with multiple people. I say you as if I'm talking to an individual, but really I'm talking to you as a company, whether that's really just you or you and a team of a half dozen other developers or whatever. When you specialize, and if you're marketing also, and if you reflect that specialization in your marketing, it comes across differently. It gives off this aura of focus and discipline, and that, trust me, that really stands out from what most of your peers are doing. But what most of your peers are doing is very vague by comparison. And it feels very, I mean, you should just do this sometime. You should go find 10 software development company websites and just read through and try to figure out what they do and what really is different about them. I think you'll come up empty most of the time in terms of figuring out what's really different about them. They just, they kind of blend into this blob of, undifferentiated, very similar looking companies. And as soon as you specialize, you start to stand out from that blob. And it exudes this quality of focus and discipline, and those build trust. So even if it's not relevant proof, that quality of being focused and disciplined builds trust. And then finally, there's what I call the startlingly accurate diagnosis. I've seen this firsthand. I get in a conversation with someone. They're not sold yet, but they know from the questions I ask and the things that I say that I know exactly what's wrong with them or wrong with their business. That is what I call the startlingly accurate diagnosis. When that happens, and as a generalist, you might think, oh, I could never do that. I doubt it. I doubt you could never do that. I bet if you learned how to ask good questions, you could do that more often than you think. In the wake of the startlingly accurate diagnosis, prospects, I've seen it. It's like a switch goes off and they're ready to talk about solving the problem. They're done trying to figure out if I'm the right person, and they're now ready to talk about working with me and only me to solve that problem. I believe that happens in any professional services situation, not just the kind of work I do. And that can be a tool that overcomes a deficit in terms of relevant proof. So here's your game plan. Obviously, if you have relevant proof, use it. The more the better. Okay. There's no limit. Don't stop at just one or two. If you can, I gave you that 9-item checklist. I don't expect anybody to have memorized that as I was saying it, but there's a lot of different ways you can offer proof. So use as much relevant proof as you potentially have. And don't stop with just what you have now. If you can circle back to previous clients and get relevant proof that you neglected to get at the time, do that. If you have very little relevant proof or you feel like it's not enough, you need to construct proof. Okay. So get started on that process as early as possible because it takes time. It takes time to, interview people or write articles or do screencasts or whatever, however it is you're going to construct some proof. So get an early start on that. Of course, make use of ambient proof. Over time, what I like to see is ambient proof become displaced by relevant proof because that's a feedback mechanism that tells me someone's specialization is actually working. But when you're starting out, you may have to use more ambient proof than is ideal. Remember, ambient proof is not as powerful as relevant proof. So you may have to get by with what you have in terms of ambient proof until you have more relevant proof. And then finally, one of the things I said earlier on is that the best specializations are a highly functional combination of your interest, your credibility, and the market's demand. So make sure you specialize in something you're interested in, okay? And use that to amplify everything else. Use your interest and your curiosity about helping your prospects to demonstrate to them. And I'm not saying it's going to completely short circuit their need for proof, but it will help if you are clearly in their corner, working for them, fighting for them, trying to help improve their business. That makes you look like the kind of insider that they're happy to have come across. I've gone a little over what I meant to. I want to just wrap up by saying this transition from generalist to specialist is, it's easy for some people, but for a lot of folks, it's challenging. And it's challenging enough just the way it is. You don't need to make it harder. So when I talk about building constructed proof, I'm also, you may have noticed, describing something that looks a lot like content marketing or inbound marketing. Content marketing is wonderful, but I have found that it tends to be slow to produce results, and the results you want are twofold. One is to build trust with prospects. That can happen right away, but content marketing generating good leads may take a little longer time. And so don't rely just on content marketing or inbound marketing. Do some outbound. I can't really dive into how you would do that. I mean, not here, elsewhere I could. Do some outbound because it will get you conversations faster, and that's going to help accelerate the whole process and also should get you business faster if you do it well. So quick recap. This is all really about building trust. Maybe I suckered you into something that you already knew. But it really is all about building trust. Relevant proof helps, but so do ambient and constructed proof. And having little to no relevant proof is a disadvantage, but you can offset it by looking at other ways of building trust. Let's do some Q&A. I'm going to kill the slide presentation here, see what's shown up in the chat window. And yeah, let me just stop screen sharing. Hold on a sec. There we go. Okay. All right. I am going to read through this awesome backlog. All right. Bernard asks, how long until I should give up on a vertical because it does not seem to work out? I believe that you can structure your research in perhaps two phases. Bernard, one is a couple things. I'm just going to go through this real quick because I want to get to as many questions as I can. So if you're focusing on a market vertical, look at the NAICS table to see the size of the market vertical. Make sure it's between 1,000 and 10,000 companies. If it's not, then you're going to have to further subdivide it. look at the number of competitors you have. By the way, some of these numbers come from David C. Baker, who's done awesome research on this subject. So look at the number of competitors you have. That is something you want to see between 10 and I think David's top number is like 100 or 200 competitors. If there are no competitors, that is usually a red sign, a red flag, like in soccer. That's a pretty strong warning that this may not be a viable way of focusing. If you're focused on some kind of something that has a technology component, like I've been talking to a lot of people recently who are thinking about specializing in Internet of Things related tech. And look at where that is on what's called the Gartner Hype Cycle, HYPE. Most people know who Gartner is. They're a research firm, and that's their way of assessing how technologies move through this pretty predictable cycle of excessive hype, and then that peaks at a certain point, and then it kind of slides down, and people become disillusioned because of the hype. Doesn't match the actual capabilities of the software. And this has been true of almost every technology. And then it kind of stabilizes. It would be nice to know, if you're thinking about specializing in a technology like Internet of Things, where that shows up on the Gartner Hype Cycle. And that's really what I would suggest in terms of just a basic preliminary layer of research. And then you might start reaching out to people, doing interviews to see if the problems you think exist actually exist, and if the market is receptive to you as an outsider trying to learn more about it. I would say in some cases you might need to commit 6 months to that sort of two-phase process in order to have enough evidence that it is or is not a good way of focusing. I have about 20 topics that I have identified as needing a deeper treatment for me. Specializing without relevant proof is one of those. So that's on the list for me to get to in a little more depth, but it could be months before that happens. So anyway, hopefully that helps in the meantime. Next question from Bernard. How should I sell myself when I have just started out? Is it enough to say this vertical interests me? So I would not necessarily lead with that. I would say the way you sell yourself in terms of, let's look at your web presence and then the type of conversations you might have with people. In terms of your web presence, just state the focus as a fact. Custom software development services for, logistics companies, for example. If that was your focus, just say it on your website. And then, handle the proof part in the way that I've outlined here. And that's how you would handle your web presence. Now, when you are talking to people, they may say, so Bernard, why are you focused on logistics? See, we almost never talk to software developers who focus on logistics. It must be really boring. Why are you interested in it? That it doesn't happen every time, but it happens often enough that I think it's worth preparing and having a thought through how you will handle that. How do you plan to handle that type of conversation? It's good to have a story. When I say a story, I don't mean a fictional story. I mean a plausible story that explains why you're interested. And that could be anything. It could be very personal. My dad was in logistics, and I thought it was super boring as a kid, but later when I grew up, I realized it's very interesting. And all those conversations around the dinner table when he was talking about his job now have given me a little bit of insider knowledge. And so I decided to specialize in serving logistics companies. So it could be very personal. It could be professional. It could be something like, I don't know a ton. I'm learning super fast. But the reason I chose this is because I saw an opportunity here, and I like the kind of, it's so important to our modern world that I just wanted to pitch in and try to make things better. So it could run the range from anything from, purely sort of a mercenary professional reason for doing it, all the way to a very personal reason. So I'm not sure that entirely answers the question, Bernard, but I think it's, you said, is it enough to say vertical XYZ interests me? That's fine. It's just good to think through that before you have the first conversation with a prospect, because if you have not practiced your story a time or two, it will come across as unpolished. Okay, moving on. Jake, quick question. What do you think of productizing, packaging services, and mentioning pricing on the website? I wish I had a simple yes, no. I think it can be a great thing. It depends so much on the market. To me, one of the ideal times to not have prices on the website is when you're brand new. So the kind of situation we're talking about now, where someone's a generalist and has just started to specialize or is thinking about it, that's probably the wrong time to put prices on your website, because what will happen is that you will have fewer conversations if you publish your pricing. Now, that's actually a benefit later down the road when you want to talk to only qualified prospects. So I would actually avoid publishing pricing earlier and wait a little bit till later to do that. And also, it's very easy, I think, if you're early to a market and you don't understand a lot about the market, it's easy to make some wrong assumptions about their needs and package things in a way that's not compatible with their needs. So I'm not at all arguing against productizing. And certain things can be productized with very little risk, like, a one-day discovery session. That's the kind of thing you can just, describe it, pick a price for it, and sell it. So again, I'm not saying any of those are bad ideas, but I think you have to think about where you are in terms of the maturity of your business and so forth. Frank says, I've personally not seen this pay off in less than 6 months. Thank you for the reality, the voice of reality and reason there. It does sometimes take time, but you can keep doing what you're doing and talk to people about specialization and then be systematically developing your proof. And that, Frank brings up a good point. Frank, by the way, is a previous star or co-star of a DevShop marketing briefing where Frank talked about specializing his company in rail security. And if you've not seen that, that presentation that Frank did, I'd recommend you check it out. There's a recording of it on my website. And Frank is kind of pointing out the what I would call the very, very prudent gradual approach to making a transition in your business. And for a lot of people, that's going to be the ideal way to do it, is to say, okay, I have made the decision, I will specialize thusly, but implement that decision in a more gradual process. And that does lessen some of the requirements for relevant proof, because you can pick up, you can start trying to have conversations that would develop that first project in your area of specialization, but you've got other stuff going on. You have other projects happening. So you're not so worried about when that first project happens. It's not quite a side hustle, but you're trying to develop it in parallel with running your existing business. Vern asks, Philip, Vern, good to see you. What strategy do you recommend for breaking into a vertical market where prospects insist on direct experience in their industry? I've been trying to get into building apps for controlling medical devices, but I haven't done a medical device app. Lots of crickets, in spite of 7 years of building device-connected apps in other industries and direct experience building web-based software for HIPAA. Prospects want the exact combination of experience before taking me seriously. I would suggest two things. One is that depending on the kind of bandwidth you have available, develop the app as a sort of side project or proof of concept that you could show them. So you do it as a sort of developing the app becomes a marketing exercise. And that's not guaranteed to work by any means, Vern, but it's something to consider, is build something open source have it in a way that can be shown off, and you didn't get paid to build it, and it's obviously going to be smaller and less robust than an app you would get paid to build. But that's something to think about. Again, that's kind of, I don't know what I would rate the chances of success of that as, much, much, much less than 100%. And the second thing is just keep looking for a less stringent client who is not, it sounds like your client is pretty close to what I defined as the world's most demanding prospect. So just try to find somebody who's less stringent to get that first project to get that relevant proof. So really, everything I'm saying is you're probably going to have to invest in getting enough proof to even get the first project. And if that's more investment than you would want, then pick a different vertical where the requirements are less stringent, or just give it more time and hope that that prospect with less demanding requirements comes across the transom. Frank notes that when you're a specialist and get a referral from another developer because they're not specialized, it's almost magic. There's no selling to do. Absolutely. Bernard says, from your experience, how probable is it that my first choice of a vertical is a winner? Or in other words, how likely is it that I made the wrong choice and have to change? I wish I could say, and one of the things I'm trying to improve in my business is my own data collection about the clients that I work with. It depends more than anything on your attitude. Attitude is not the right word. Not like, oh, you have a bad attitude, you need to shape up, mister. But it depends more than anything on how you approach this whole thing. I have not only half jokingly in the past recommended that if people cannot decide on how to specialize, that they print out the NAICS diagram, put it on the wall, and throw a dart. And wherever the dart lands, they choose that vertical to specialize in. I know almost no one would do that. Very few people would benefit from doing that, but I say it to make a point, which is that statistically speaking, there's very few verticals that could not actually support you as a specialist. But if you made a random choice, and let's say you picked pharmaceuticals, you might hate pharmaceuticals, or you might feel like they're, ethically suspect because they pay their executives so much, or I don't know, you might have a million reasons why that's not a good choice for you. So that's why when I take people through this process, I always start with their interest. And I say, take anything off the list that you have previous experience with that you are not interested in. Because, all right, a little bit of tough love lecture here. This is probably not going to be true of all of you. If you are a reasonably good, reasonably proficient software developer, failure for you at self-employment means you get a job. Getting a job may feel terrible, but it means you are probably not below the 70th percentile of earning capability in the United States of America. In fact, if you're the average software engineer, you earn an 87th percentile salary. Out of every 100 Americans on average, only 13 could earn more than you do. Now, some of those would earn, vastly, dramatically more than you do, because some of those people are going to be Bill Gates or whatever. Failure for a self-employed software developer is not that bad in the big picture. Assuming you can get a job, which in most places you can. May not be your preferred job, may not be an awesome job, but you can get a job. So that makes you soft. I was the same way when I started in technology, because I got my first job during the first .com boom. And so I was just on a salary escalator straight up. And it wasn't because I was a great, I wasn't working for myself, but my point is you have to pick something you're interested in. Otherwise, you just won't stick with it. You being the general software developer, not you specifically, Bernard. So if you had a more mercenary perspective, if you were like, I can make this work, then probably it's an 80% chance that any vertical is good enough for you. But because a lot of us can afford to be more picky in our preferences, I'm going to say it's maybe 50-50 that your first vertical is a good one. And again, if you eliminate all the obviously bad choices, that raises the chance that your first vertical will be potentially a good one. Mark has asked, does it make sense to choose more than one vertical and try and see which one sticks? Sometimes you can do that, but most of us have enough trouble, if we're like a solo operator, we have enough trouble marketing ourselves to one vertical that we become spread too thin if we choose more than one. So I would not do that in parallel. I would do it serially. I would try to set up small experiments that validate whether vertical A is good enough. And if it's not, move on to vertical B. But don't try several in parallel. Bryce asked, is the startup industry a sufficiently vertical market or is it too broad? Depends. If you are pursuing the path of focusing on a skill set or a technology platform, two things happen. If you're really, really good, you might be able to make a case that startups are a good, they're a pseudo vertical. I wouldn't really call them a vertical. Let's call them a pseudo vertical. If you have excellent technical skills, that may make sense because they may respond to that value proposition. But you got to remember, the flip side of that coin is that people with really good technical skills are throwing themselves at startups all day long because they're cool, fun places to work. And they promise a lack of boredom and, potentially equity and stuff like that. So the competition is pretty stiff in the world of startups. I would say it would be better to pick an actual vertical and then go after the startups in that vertical. So, biotechnology or, medicine or finance or just, almost any vertical is going to have new startup companies within the vertical. So I would focus things that way. Bryce, I think that's one thing to think about. The other thing to think about is you have people like Peter Thiel who are writing in his book, 0 to 1, multiple times. I think 3 times, I'm not even finished with the book yet. 3 times he has warned people to not bring on consultants, people who are founding startups. He says they are not bought into the same incentive structure that full-time employees are. And they're more concerned with immediate cash than long-term equity. And he says that makes them a bad fit. And so when people like that, who are like gods to most startup founders, are warning startups to not hire outside consultants, it makes things even worse. I'm not saying it's not viable, but it's kind of a tough competition. So I agree with some of the follow-on comments to that question from Bryce. Sorry, Bryce, if that's disappointing, but I'm here to give you pragmatic advice. And some people make it work, but one thing I have found that's very beneficial, by the way, if you're focusing on startups, is physical proximity, because you can kind of mix and mingle and become known in the startup ecosystem or the sort of social circles that startup people run in. And that can help. And then if you have, I'm going to pick on Frank here, and if you have a really valuable specialization like Frank does, like Rails security, I could see some startups responding to that value proposition and going against Peter Thiel's advice and hiring you for that kind of specialist thing. So a pretty strong specialization like that can also make it easier to sell to startups. But you probably would financially, quite honestly, do better selling that same stuff to companies like Equifax. Okay. Let's see here. Christopher asks, what's the best way to approach prospects for interviews? I've seen a lot of things work. I've seen social work, like particularly Twitter. I'll give the example of a really awesome guy in my positioning accelerator program. His name is Steven. Steven, for a while, I think he's kind of moved on from this, but was investigating. He's a generalist Rails developer. He was investigating deep sea freight transport, or the sort of marine transportation sector, which seems like a super boring, super old world, super not sexy, interesting vertical. People in that vertical are terrified of the implication, or not terrified. Terrified is not the right word. They are very interested in the implications of blockchain technology for how that might change their custody of people's freight. And I was pretty surprised when he told me this, because that seemed like one of the last places you'd expect to see people talking about blockchain and actually seriously interested in how that might apply to their industry. Remember, Steven's a Rails developer, but he's fully, I mean, all of y'all are fully capable of doing enough just-in-time learning about something like blockchain to speak intelligently to prospects who feel like you know more about it than they do. And so, he was able to leverage social media very easily to spin up conversations with people about this, because he was talking about a topic that is right there, headed up towards the Gartner's peak of inflated expectations on their hype cycle graph. So everybody's just like, I don't know, are we idiots for not having already done this? Are we going to miss out? Is this going to put us out of business? Like that kind of energy makes people much more open to talking to strangers who seem to know a thing or two about that thing. But, a different topic, a different industry might not, I don't think you would get those same results, because it's just a different combination of factors. Email tends to be the go-to for doing cold outreach like that. So, Christopher, I would say unless you have, try both is what I would say. But email tends to be the sort of old, reliable workhorse. Dennis asks, what kind of proof can be used in cases where you have solid experience in the target market but are not able to talk or show previous projects because of NDAs, or clients having these projects publicly available? Huge gray area. I actually did some work for a client who had that exact situation. They had built, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of code for something that turned into a successful new line of business for a big Fortune 500 company. And they had me write a case study on it with the understanding that they were never going to show it publicly. They were only going to show it to like people they were in a sales conversation with, and maybe make them sign an NDA to even see the case study. So I've seen people do that. That's about as far, I think, as you can take that gray area. It's really unfortunate when those kind of NDAs start getting thrown down on the table. It usually means that you have you're working with a prospect or a client who has let's say a mature legal department, and the legal department has like real say over what does and doesn't get said by the marketing department. And it's just tough, man. That's actually one of the downsides of working with Fortune 500 companies, is it can be difficult later to have them provide proof that you can use in your marketing. So I would say you might be able to work out some arrangement where you're able to use their name but not reveal any details. And you can say, yeah, I worked for Apple, I worked for IBM, or whatever. But it's the same thing. I mean, you're in a situation where you have less usable, relevant proof, even though your actual proof situation is pretty good. So you just have to fall back to those other forms of proof, and it kind of sucks, but that's the only way I can think of to do it. Jim asks, regarding cold email to setting up interviews, yes, I do have a good cold email template I can share with you. If you want to stay on the line for a minute, I can drop that in the chat. That's actually going to be perhaps the best way for me to share that with y'all. Give me just a second here. While I'm doing that, I've reached the end of the chat questions, and I'm happy to hang out a little longer. Does anybody else have any questions you want to run past me on this? If you do, just unmute yourself and give me your question. Okay, I just dropped that in the chat, that cold email template for setting up a interview. Jonas asks, as a developer who's worked many years building custom e-commerce platforms, I have never experienced a company hiring a specialist developer for a tough problem. Cool. It happens. But Jonas, can you unmute? I'd love to like talk about that a little more with you if it's convenient for you to unmute. Because here are the questions I would ask for Jonas. Have you, like, what kind of companies have you worked for? Would be my number one question. They may be companies, I don't know. I would be making assumptions, but I would assume they have the kind of team they need in-house or something like that. But yeah, I'd love to learn more about that, Jonas. Jay asks, how do we pivot and showcase our skills when it is a new niche or space we are entering? For example, I work with creatives who want to target wedding professionals more. I think what will pull you in that direction is if you could identify the top 3 to 6 problems that are unique to, let's say, wedding professionals, to that kind of business. So, creatives are going to have a broad array of problems. Wedding professionals, I'm sure they're going to have at least 2 or 3, probably more like a dozen problems that are specific to the kind of business they run. Maybe it's stuff like, I don't know, I'm thinking of weddings and I'm thinking of all the stereotypes about demanding brides in weddings. Maybe there's something there that's like a business problem or a very persistent kind of problem for that type of client. Find out what those are, and in your marketing, start talking about those problems. And I think it will naturally pull you to a position that's more compelling and credible for that type of client. I know that's a little vague, but that's the general thing I would be thinking about. Okay. Any last questions?
Yeah, Philip.
Hey.
I'm just figuring trying to text this into this chat is probably going to be more complicated than it needs to be. But yeah, so I've been focusing on like, okay, what direction do I go? This, that, and the other, and just all my past. In general, I'm a creative, just designer, and then I also do front-end dev. Okay. But my focus, what I'm wanting to do is a lot of my clients in the past have been e-commerce, Magento or Shopify or whatever.
Okay.
But so now it's a matter of like, all right, let's really niche this thing down and get all super hyper focused. And the things that I've been kind of running into is, what do I present to these guys? Because, and again, it started like this empty portfolio. It's like everyone, oh yes, I love the design. I love what you've done with the UI to help the product page, yada, yada. Yeah. And then when I've gone out there to do research on what do these store owners, what are their pains? What are the problems? What are they dealing with? They're not dealing with UI. They're dealing with Amazon and shipping and all these other things. So like, how can I still stand the ground as being this designer that likes to do the front end dev and build it all out, custom e-com, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. And then, but yet all the problems on all these forums out there have nothing to do with UI for e-commerce. It doesn't seem that apparent, but at the same time, I kind of feel like, oh, the ROI, the SEO, all this. And it's like, and now in the back end of my head, it's like, well, it's great if you do even have all that lined up and you do know your target of who you want to sell your product to. And then they get to this site and it's crap. Yeah. So then I thought, all right, what if I go ahead and say, I'll do, sort of like a UI audit on your e-commerce site. And that'll be sort of that ISO type thing and lead into it. But I just don't know. I just feel like I'm going to be totally disconnected because I don't know that level of stuff. I don't know the ROI and all the I guess the logistics of the store owner, because I'm not a store owner, I'm just the designer. So it's like this conundrum of like, how this is the space I've always done work, for the last 10 years. And I thought, all right, well, let me just focus on Shopify stores. So I really tried that for about 6 months, but the customers that were coming to me, Shopify was not a good fit because they need some custom thing that was outside of having to build a custom app in Shopify. So then I'm like, all right, can't do that. So then can I broaden it to say, well, because that's what I figured. All right, I'm a Shopify expert. I'm your design guy, and I'll do that. I'll build it out for you too, because that was the twofer. I'm a designer and coder. And then, but it just kept on hitting this wall. And then when I was doing that research, like, what do you do when all the research and all the questions on these forums have nothing to do with platform and UI? You know, how do I pull that in and deal with that? And then, but would it be bad to pull back to say, you know, listen, like, we can do this? Because also another thing that's kind of happening is this whole end of life with Magento 1.x, whatever. So it's people, and even replatforming to 2.0, it really is a replatform. So I thought maybe I can do a page where that, like, hey, I'll help you replatform because you're putting off the inevitable. Just deal with it now. It's going to break your. So that's where I'm kind of like all these jumbled ideas, but, you know, like all the research and even the store owners that my past clients, when I talk to them, and even some of them that have had to shut down because of Amazon. You know, and I'm like, but that has nothing to do with me. They're like, dude, Pat, you were awesome. You did everything you needed. Like the design, the code, responsiveness, all that stuff for mobile, everything was solid. But the logistics of having to run their e-commerce business was killed because of X, Y, and Z, mainly because of Amazon. So I don't know, like, how do I take this? To me, it just seems so general, but I also want to hyper focus to make this thing work for me. So I don't seem like, hey, yes, I do e-commerce and hire me, you know, like, what do you do? Right. With something like that.
Okay. That's an awesome question. I just want to commend you, on the level of research you've done is far beyond what most people are willing to do. And you're noticing, as many do, that it starts to become this sort of, stew of all these things, and it gets murky before it gets clear. And that is also a natural part of the process. So don't feel bad about that. I was curious about the CRO angle. I didn't hear you talk about conversion rate optimization, and that's usually what I see designers do when they want to start talking about a business benefit to their work. Can you talk a little bit about, maybe you considered that, or was that in the mix somewhere?
Well, that is it. I mean, honestly, one of the things that I ask these people when I bring that up, like, how are you measuring your conversion? Because I do think that design can be measured. When you put something like that analytical to it, when you're saying, okay, well, you know, we're realizing on Hotjar or whatever other analytical thing that they're using, or whatever they internally in their head think is right. But just say, okay, cool, let's throw that down. And, you know, if we are making this change in the design, you know, whatever it is, maybe it's your feature set or how your homepage is, whatever that funnel is to getting to that conversion, because it was always this thing that I would hear from people. It's like, man, I'm paying, you know, $2,500, $5,000 a month on SEO, and I'm not getting anything. But I have the ranking, I have it all. I said, it's probably because when they get to their site, they have nowhere to do. They don't know where to go. You're not telling them. So then I said, well, we need to hyper focus your site and not have all this other clutter and crap, and get down there to saying, okay, now that we've already got them down to this product page and get them to check out, then that's because of those UI changes that's that measurable piece against the conversion is about the only, I mean, trying to quickly say that to you.
I get it. That really does, from a sort of pure design perspective, that does seem to be the strongest, that's the ace card up your sleeve, right? Or not from a design perspective, but from a design applied to a business problem perspective. It's either, what I see people getting some traction with is that, it's the CRO angle, or the branding angle is another one for clients who are feeling like, our stuff just doesn't feel like a brand. It's too, jumbled. It's all over the place. That's another place where I see designers come in and hook into something that's perceived as a business benefit. For some reason, I'm thinking of Samuel Hullick's user onboard business. Have you come across that, Pat?
No, honestly, I'm not sure what that is.
Let me see here.
How little have I done out there?
Let me see here. Yeah, useronboard.com, not onboarding, but onboard.com. Samuel Hullick. And so the reason I'm reminded of this is because he sells a book, and his primary business might be I don't know if he makes more on the book or in consulting, probably more in consulting, is selling consulting services to SaaS companies that want to improve their onboarding process.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that case, the sort of the connection from his work to a business outcome is lower churn, or increased trial to paid conversions. And I think the same dynamic is going to be true in yours, where you've got to hook into some kind of business metric like that they're tracking, like bounce rate or, churn or, average profitability of a site user, or just, I think if you can hook into that, that's going to be your best chance in the e-commerce world.
That's one thing you're right on. That's actually something that I think this is awesome that you're this connection to it, because that was the other part of that split for me, like what vertical do I go to? Because I was doing SaaS, just the whole thing, and what I was coming to after we would do the UI, it's all about onboarding. And so we would, they would bring me on to saying, okay, well, what can we do? And what do we for the churn and just all that. So it was, but that's what I think. All it came down to was money.
Yeah.
In the end, like it was just, how can I save money or make money? and then they start throwing all these, well, are you series A, B, C? And I'm like, whoa. I'm not that guy. I'm a designer, I'm not, this, dealing with or that kind of stuff. But that helps. Yeah. Just knowing what, but just that SaaS world and everything was just, I have more in e-com. So I'm like, all right, let me pull, that's what I was thinking, trying to do something where can we do this whole onboard reduce churn type of terminology or, esque stuff like the onboarding in apps to that. But then I didn't see that because I just saw it more about shipping and customer relation and that as the pains and problems that people were barking about. Like,
yeah.
But then I'm also not dealing with the money and all that. But I guess it's, how do you merge that, these UI things that are this design changes and so forth are going to help actually, reduce your churn or increase your community or your conversion rate to sales or whatever.
I've seen the people who really seem to take to the Shopify platform. I think they like the constrained nature of the platform, meaning you don't have carte blanche in what you can do, right? There's some kind of firewalls about what you can and can't do, right?
Yeah.
Even from a design perspective. So if that rubs you the wrong way, it's like for some people, there's constraints are great because they're like, oh, great, I can accept these limitations and really sort of fine tune a process within them that makes me more profitable because not everything can be done. And so, it's not the sky's the limit. And those kind of more process-driven, somewhat standardized projects can be more profitable. Mm-hmm. So I see people like kind of embrace that. And I'm not saying, oh, that's what you should do, Pat, but it's something it's worth thinking about, because if those constraints are more problems for you, those constraints that Shopify imposes, then maybe, kind of looking at one of these less sexy players like Magento or BigCommerce or some of the others might be a better fit for you. And I could see something that's like replatforming from Magento 1 to Magento 2 is a problem that probably has about a 5-year shelf life, 3 to 5 years maybe.
Right, because what's going to happen when 3.0 comes out? That was, actually not to totally get into this one client case study I'm talking about, but we actually totally were going to do a private app for them. They had this whole algorithm for this thing, and they're kind of farm diet sort of stuff or whatever. Mm-hmm. So we go through and we build this whole deal in Shopify. They were totally on board with Shopify, sold them on the whole thing. And we get down to it, and because of Shopify's whole point of their existence really is the credit card and processing fees and everything, but their partners don't allow people to sell under pharmaceutical, and that's what they were. And that was like, I would have never been able to discover that until we actually had this particular client come across with this one thing, and they did not want to go away from authorized.net. So it was like, you still have to pay Shopify's percentages plus another 1 point. And they had such a great deal with authorized.net, and their margins are so low to be able to make this work for them. we had to stick with Magento. So we actually had to re-platform them to Magento 2 and restart everything from the ground zero. You know, it was like, oh my God. So it's like it's not really my pain. That was just their, that's just their, and there was a couple other clients like, well, their data provider didn't have a connection with Shopify. You know, they only had it with Magento. So it was really that customer base of that pool of customers that I seem to have were all like just their resources were so tied into something that only worked for Magento. So then I'm like, gosh, man, I'm just not finding anyone that is that small to medium business model that Shopify really works for, the out of the box thing. But then I'm like, well, how the heck do I find them? But when I'm finding my research, I'm not seeing anyone who's saying, you know, hey, I'm a small to medium business that needs this or whatever.
Yeah.
That's where I don't know. I mean, if you know of like some sites or some of these research sites where I could possibly dig in, or how do I put, that's where I don't know. Like I'm hitting the wall. Every time I come out with something, there's some other piece in it, or at least just the people that I'm somehow attracting. It's just not working out, you know. And it's like, that's why I ditched out of the SaaS world and went back to e-com. And then even that, I'm like,
okay,
this is not cool.
Yeah. Well, I don't know specifically, other than reaching out to companies that fit a certain profile and trying to, just do some interviews. That's about the best I have in terms of research. I will say that I'm not super into the Magento world, so I can't say for sure, but it seems like offering a specific service that's around a platform transition or moving from Magento 1 point whatever to 2 point whatever, that could be a good lead gen source because it's so specific and so likely to match up with something people are searching for. If you are one of not many people who are offering this as a explicitly defined productized service, that could be good lead gen that leads into more general design work. And so in a way, you could specialize in a type of service you offer that is super attractive to people who are experiencing this problem that's going to last for about 3 years. The problem of moving, from something to Magento 2.0. That may be worth looking into a little more. And so that's actually not really the conversion rate optimization thing we're talking about. It's a completely different problem.
Right.
Yeah. It could, I've seen, I see that happen where people get hired for, the migration, and then they kind of become a preferred resource for that company moving forward.
Right. But then that's also my thing is I don't want to be stuck as the re-platform tech guy. That's why I figured, well, I thought maybe this could be the doorstep to try and get more of that relevant proof of actually truly successful ones that are staying around.
That's true. Yeah. If your ultimate goal was, I want to be, considered an expert in using design to optimize conversion rate, for example, then yes, becoming known as the platform migration guy may not support that larger goal.
Yeah.
But also it could be very easy to spin up, a sort of one-page site, kind of like you see Samuel Hullock doing. His is more than one page, but it's still a very simple site whose sole purpose is not really to position you as a person, but just to get leads for a service. So it's something I would say give some thought to. But again, it does have to be compatible with your larger goals and where you're trying to take your business.
Gotcha. What was that last one that you were saying? That the person's Steve what?
Like the Samuel Hullock site, like the one.
Oh, Samuel Hullock. Sorry.
Yeah, I just think his site is a good example of a site that uses content to attract really relevant people, prospects for his consulting services.
Okay, and that's not this user onboard guy?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, sorry. Samuel Hullock is the name of the person behind useronboard.com.
Gotcha. Okay.
I interviewed Samuel in my podcast, the Consulting Pipeline podcast. So if you go pretty far back, you'll see that episode with him, and that might be interesting to you.
Okay. Yeah. It's just, I have to get something up, and then it's just they're all flopping out because I'm missing it. It's like,
yeah.
No, anyway, but I don't want to keep up all your time with my little
ish. Well,
Thank
Pat,
you.
thanks for the question. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Okay. I am going to wrap this sucker up. Thank you all for being here. If you have questions that this spurred and you think about it later while you're commuting to work or taking a shower or making dinner, just reach out, Philip at philipmorganconsulting.com. Be happy to do what I can to try to help, and hope to see you all soon. This is where I hang up on you unceremoniously. But again, thank you all for being here. Talk to you soon.